Hi, everybody, and welcome to Big Joe's Journal. My name is Joe Tilden, and I am the host of this program. Well, here we are getting toward the end of October, and let's talk about a few pleasant things at first. The fall sports scene, as far as our local high schools are concerned, are coming to an end. The football playoffs beginning this weekend, and within a couple of weeks, we will know who our football champions are in all three divisions. Also, our other sports are winding up, our fall sports. And it makes you realize how short really the fall sports season is at the scholastic level. Usually beginning the end of August, winds up the first part of November. Well, as far as Major League sports are concerned, we now know our participating teams in this year's World Series, the Houston Astros, and a team nobody ever thought would get there, and those are the Washington Nationals. I would say Washington has got to be the Cinderella team. It's the first time a World Series has been played in the nation's capital since 1933, and that is the year that I was born. So 86 years. The 1933, they were the Washington Senators at that time, and they lost the World Series in 1933 to the New York Giants, who are still playing at the Polo Grounds in New York. The Washington Senators are now the Minnesota Twins. And of course, another team, expansion team, moved into Washington after the Senators left, and they also call themselves the Senators. And they are now the Texas Rangers out of Dallas. And this team that is calling themselves the Washington Nationals now started off as the Montreal Expos. And they had some good teams in Montreal. They made the playoffs, I think, 2 or 3 times, but never made the World Series. But because of poor attendance in Montreal and a lot of dissatisfaction with the home field, they moved to Washington, a new stadium in Washington. And they're now the Washington Nationals. And those of you that follow baseball, as you know, their season started off kind of on the wrong foot. At one time, they were toward the bottom of their division with a record of 19 wins and 31 setbacks. And there was talk of firing their manager. But they made a few changes, a few trades that helped them along, improved their bullpen by getting 2 relievers that would help them out. Doolittle from Oakland, and the reliever, his name escapes me right now, from Toronto. And they got hot at the end of the season. Now, this long layoff that they have had, is that going to cool them off? Well, we don't know. At the start of the year, everybody talked about the World Series, and they said this year it's going to be the Dodgers and the Yankees. The Yankees spent big bucks, brought in all these big superstars. And the Yankees made it part way. Their big dream ended on Saturday night when Houston beat them 6-4 in the 6th game of a best 4 out of 7 playoff series. And going into the World Series, Houston will be a heavy favorite. Houston won the World Series 2 years ago when they defeated the Dodgers. So they have the Nationals this year, and they're going to be the heavy favorites. The Nationals went in as underdogs all through this playoff season and have surprised everybody by coming out on top. So we'll see what happens as we wind down the line. You know, with the rain that they're having in the southeastern part of the country, and that includes Washington, it's very, very necessary. They're going through a drought down there. And so, although people are saying, well, maybe it's going to screw up all of our athletic events and all that, it's worth it. It's worth it to replenish their water supply, especially their groundwater. Many of the farmers down through Georgia and South Carolina, parts of North Carolina, were very, very concerned about the lack of water. And it'd be just a matter of time before all the municipalities down there would be having concerns with their water supply. But these few days of rain, and they're going to have some more, and hopefully that will solve the problem and break the drought, and they will be all right. Well, the World Series is going to open in Houston, and that's an enclosed ballpark, Minute Maid Park, mainly because it's owned by the corporation that manufactures Minute Maid orange juice. And those of you that have seen the Houston Astros play on TV, as you know, way in the outfield, high on top of the fence, there's a locomotive, and it's pulling a cart full of oranges. And of course, every time an Astro hits a home run, the old train cranks up, rolls across the track, carrying that whole cart full of oranges. And then, of course, it backs up in case there's another home run hit by an Astro. So the series is going to open in Houston Tuesday and Wednesday. Have a day off Thursday, and if the rain has stopped and things have dried out, games 3 and 4, Friday night, Saturday night, will be in Washington. Game 5 on Sunday night, if necessary, will be in Washington. Then a day off on Monday, and they go back to Houston for Tuesday and Wednesday. So that will be this year's World Series. Now, outside the World Series, as many of you may be aware who are baseball fans, 8 managers were fired at the end of this season. One of those fired was Joe Madden of the Chicago Cubs. But he has a job. He's going back to the team he started with. They call themselves the Anaheim Angels now. They used to be the California Angels and the LA Angels. Now they're the Anaheim Angels. And Joe Madden got a start there as a player and also as a coach before moving on to become manager at Tampa Bay and later the Chicago Cubs. So he has been given a 3-year contract to go back with the club he started with. He's going to be managing them. Well, the contract says 3 years, but you know, the day a manager is hired is the day closer to the day he'll be fired. So you got to win. If you don't win, you're unemployed until you get hired somewhere else. And usually a lot of these managers, they move around a bit. For Joe Madden now, this will be the 3rd team he's managed. And there's rumor that Joe Girardi, who managed the Florida Marlins for a while, then the New York Yankees for a lot of years, won a World Series in 2009 with the Yankees, and then was fired, that he will be getting a managerial job. Rumor has it that he's going to be the new manager of the Mets. Also, there's a possibility, since he lives in Chicago, that he may be the new manager of the Chicago Cubs. He played with the Cubs a few years back. He was, I believe, the backup catcher. The same role he had with the Yankees for a number of years, backing up Theron Munson. So, time will tell. And there's some other vacancies that got to be filled. Detroit, Kansas City, San Francisco, San Diego, and there's a few others. I just can't think of all of them offhand here. But that is baseball. And in football, college season well underway. In the NFL, New England Patriots, San Francisco 49ers are still undefeated. And the Patriots will be playing their 2nd game with the New York Jets tonight, the day I'm taping this program, which is the 20th of October, or 21st of October, 21st of October. And the Pats and the Jets will be getting together again in the Meadowlands in New Jersey. So the season moves on. Well, turning to a more serious side, political side, As you know, a few weeks ago, the United States embarrassed itself. We pulled off one of the biggest double crosses in our history, abandoning our Kurd allies over in Syria. And you look at this and you say, how did this come about? Well, you know, the Kurds did most of the fighting in getting rid of ISIS, fought alongside American troops. And there are folks that our American troops could trust, not like our so-called Afghan allies, where some of our troops are being killed by Afghan soldiers that they trained. For example, the mayor of North Ogden, Utah, father of 7 children, belonged to the Utah National Guard, which was federalized, went to Afghanistan. He was an officer, and his assignment was to help train Afghan troops to fight the Taliban. Well, what happened, one of the troops he was training, one of the Afghan soldiers he was training, shot him in the head, deliberately shot him in the head. And of course, as soon as he had accomplished that dirty deed, some of the other Afghan soldiers that were with him turned and shot him. But for the mayor of North Ogden, it was his 4th deployment. And as I said, he leaves a widow, and he leaves 7 kids. Well, the Kurds were not like that. They were our faithful and trusted allies, fought alongside our men. And they carried the brunt of the fighting in eliminating ISIS. So what happens when that idiot at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue calls his old buddy in Turkey, Erdogan, who was just as ruthless a dictator as Trump would like to be, and says, we're pulling out. We're going to pull our troops out of North Syria, the safety zone that the Kurds had set up. You want to go in? It's all yours. And of course, Turkey did. With our troops leaving, they left ISIS, or not ISIS, but they left the Kurds to their own mercy, and bombed and used superior military force to push these people, to punish these people who are fighting back. Well, at the same time, Turkey got a little help. As the U.S. vacated, who's ready to take their place? Would you believe Russian troops and Syrian troops? Well, this wasn't a spur-of-the-moment thing. You've got to wonder who dictated this whole operation. And it looks like it was Mr. Putin in Moscow. He's got a stooge in Washington. He lives at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. And what would trigger this takeover? The call to Erdogan saying, all right, everything's all set. We're pulling out. You can move in. The whole operation was too closely pulled together and too closely coordinated to have to be a spur-on-the-moment thing. I think this had been in the planning for a long time. Our military is totally unaware of it. The Pentagon was caught totally surprised by the presidential order for U.S. troops to pull out of northern Syria and leave the Kurds to the mercy of the military might of Turkey, Russia, and what's left of the Syrian army. A shameful, shameful, shameful day in American history. But when we've got a shameful, shameful president, what can you expect? I think General Mattis The former Secretary of Defense, speaking in Washington, summed it up pretty well. He said, "We in the military earned our spurs on the field of battle. Our commander-in-chief got his spurs in a doctor's letter." Tells the whole story right there. And so what does Mr. Chicken, I won't say what I'm going to follow it with. What does he do? Well, he tries to justify his betrayal of our allies, his betrayal of the United States of America. He says, well, the Kurds were communists anyway. They're freeing all these ISIS prisoners. You know, another lie, another lie. Somebody apparently got to him and said, hey, listen, stupid. These people were our allies. They lost 11,000 fighters fighting ISIS. They had 25,000 wounded fighting ISIS. And they did it with us. They did it for us. And now you've turned your back on them. Well, he comes out and he changes his tone. Oh, they're great people and so forth. So he sends his errand boy, Vice President Pence, and that overweight Secretary of State, who's virtually worthless, over to Turkey to work out a truce. And they give Turkey everything they wanted. The great negotiator. He hasn't won a negotiating thing since he's been in office. Little chop in North Korea made him look like a fool, which he is anyway. Putin is calling the shots, which is pretty obvious. And a fellow dictator in Turkey, Erdogan, the guy's coming to the U.S. for a state visit in another 2 or 3 weeks. He should be banned from coming into this country. And then, of course, there's a crown prince in Saudi Arabia, our so-called ally, kidnapping an American citizen and butchering him. You know, under any other president, real American president, Saudi Arabia would have got a lap full of missiles. If I were president, I'd end all military aid to Saudi Arabia and say, you guys are on your own. If Iran wants to come in and overrun you, so be it. And I think I would send a warning to Turkey to pull out of Syria, or Istanbul will just be history. Not going to happen with this guy. As General Mattis said, he got his bone spurs in a doctor's letter. The former, well, I guess he still does write outdoor columns for the Rutland Herald, pretty well summed up the character of our so-called commander-in-chief. He said when the doctors checked him out, they found out he had bone spurs. They also found out he didn't have any backbone. And I think that pretty well sums it up. You know, there are a number of things in our history, really, that we have to be ashamed of. One is slavery. The fact that slavery flourished in the United States until it was settled, terminated, ended, at least on paper, by the Civil War and by the 13th Amendment. And yet there still is a strong, strong feeling of racism in this country that we've never gotten rid of. We're making strides toward getting rid of it, but it is still there and still strongly evident. Now and then you still see the Confederate flag flying even here in Vermont. There's a pickup truck that drives around. I'm sure they have to be Trump supporters, you know, because obviously they don't have very many brains. Has a Confederate flag attached to the back. He goes around flying that. You kind of wonder, you know, what direction we're headed. And I think it brings up the importance of this upcoming election in 2020. One thing about this 2020 election, it'll be 100 years from the time women were given the right to vote. You know, the 13th Amendment terminated slavery. The 15th Amendment gave all men the right to vote. And many, well, they called them suffragettes in those days, seeking women's rights and all that. They weren't happy with that 15th Amendment because it said only men can have the right to vote. Well, it would be many, many years. It wouldn't be until the passing of the 19th Amendment that gave women the right to vote. And the first election that they were eligible to vote in was 1920. So 2020, 100 years since every citizen in the United States has had the right to vote. And yet today in many areas, there are certain people trying to put restrictions on who can vote and who can't vote. A lot of people are worried about the huge number of Hispanics that will be eligible to vote in this upcoming election. Namely, some of our radical Republicans. And you hate to see that, because the Republican Party, along with the Democratic Party, is a great political institution. And there are a lot of really, really good people in the Republican Party. Unfortunately, the leadership of the Republican Party has sold out to a radical group headed up by the nincompoop in the White House. And the message he is sending, which is racist, is being regarded as support for many of these radical racist groups, the neo-Nazis, the Ku Klux Klan. Well, Mr. Trump seems to like people like that. They're his buddies, his friends. He goes around disparaging our allies. Cheating on our friends, double-crossing those who fought alongside our people, and he seems to embrace those who are enemies. Vladimir Putin, definitely our enemy. Erdogan in Turkey, definitely our enemy. Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, certainly not our friends. Remember, the folks that caused 9/11 were not Iraqis, they were Saudis. And who financially underwrote this mission? It was Saudi Arabia. Who has helped underwrite ISIS? It's Saudi Arabia. Our troops that are stationed in Saudi Arabia, if they happen to be Christian, the Saudis don't want them having religious services. So what do? They raise the American Red Cross. They have their religious services in a tent with a Red Cross banner flying over it. So they won't offend our Saudi allies. I don't know, the whole thing upsets us, and it should. You know, when the House started talking about impeachment, I really was not in favor of it. And I felt that we should focus our efforts on the election in 2020 and getting rid of the cancer that is in our government at the administrative level. And focus on that and get rid of it that time. But now that things are happening, and they're happening real fast, and this impeachment process is underway in the House, I think I'm all for it. As long as they can build a strong case. No, I'm not sure he will be convicted in the Senate. There will be some Republicans that will put the good of the country ahead of their oath to the Republican Party and their fear of Donald Trump. And they may show a little backbone and they may come over. But the Senate is going to need 67 votes to convict. You know, an impeachment is drawn up in the House. And then it has to be tried in the Senate with the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court presiding over the Senate. Not the Vice President, but the Chief Justice. And they have to have 67 votes to convict. Well, with 47 Democrats, that means they're going to need 20 Republicans to come across the aisle. And I think under the current makeup of the U.S. Senate, that's just not going to happen. But it will not do any harm to go ahead with the impeachment proceedings. But at the same time, prepared to win big in November. And if by some unforeseen chance Trump should be reelected, if we have a Democratic-controlled House and a Democratic-controlled Senate, which is very, very possible, we can proceed with the impeachment proceedings, and I think you'll get a conviction in the Senate. But not while Mitch McConnell is the majority leader, although he himself admitted that under the Constitution, if impeachment comes before the Senate, they have to deal with it. And I think a number of Republicans are, especially with this double cross of the Kurds, there are a number of Republicans that are on the fence now. Even Lindsey Graham, who was a great friend of John McCain's, and then all of a sudden when McCain dies, old Lindsey kind of changes side a little bit. His backbone gets a little jelly in it, a little loose. And he sort of falls into Trump's camp, but even he is saying now that what Trump did was wrong. Our governor, who is one of the true old-style Republicans, agrees with the impeachment proceedings. There are a lot of good Republicans that have got to speak up. The former governor of Ohio, John Kasich, even though the Republican National Convention was held in Cleveland, Governor Kasich refused to attend, as did former Presidents Bush. Folks, and I'm going to say this to my Republican friends, you've got to take back your party. And the only way you're going to do that is to get rid of that clown you got in the White House. He's an embarrassment to you. He's an embarrassment to the country. And the sooner we're rid of him, the better things are going to be. You know, Jimmy Carter, when he was elected, he talked about a new morning in America. Ronald Reagan used the same phrase when he was elected. But you know, there is a new morning in America. And it can come about if many people who sat on their hands in 2016, who couldn't accept either candidate, and therefore didn't turn out to exercise their right and their obligation to vote, stayed home. And this is the tragedy that we got. So I urge everybody demonstrating, everybody that wants to change, everybody that loves America, turn out and vote November 2020. With that, may Almighty God in His infinite wisdom continue to bless these United States of America. God love you. Have a great week, and we'll see you all next week.